You all, for those of you returning, appreciate that, and the new faces are all very welcome. I'm, again, as I said last time, delighted to be delivering these Clark lectures and trying out with you ideas that I haven't been living with for a decade or more. They're really quite new. And I will begin, well, my first sentence is an allusion to the first verse of the Ode on Man in Antigone. There is much that is strange, yet nothing is stranger than facts. Facts both explain and reveal, and maybe that's why Henry David Thoreau wrote, I quote him, "If you stand fronting and face to face to a fact, you will see the sun glimmer on both its surfaces as if it were a scimitar, and feel its sweet edge dividing you through the marrow, and so you will happily conclude your mortal career." So let me begin today's lecture with a fact. The sun glimmers, its photons illuminate the world. Now let us stand right fronting and face to face with it. Since most of us remain completely in the dark when it comes to how much a photon must go through, how many thresholds, in fact, it must cross before it becomes visible light, I invite you to embark on a voyage with me in the next few minutes. Call it an itinerarium mentis solem, a journey of the mind into the sun. There will be a little physics involved, but nothing that an open-minded humanist can't follow with a little concentration. So, we have set the controls for the heart of the sun. I had to get one Pink Floyd allusion here at the city of Cambridge. As we approach the star, we pass through its corona, then its photosphere, then its convection and radiative zones, and arrive in thought at its inner core. Here, the temperature and pressure are unimaginably intense enough to force two protons to overcome their natural repulsion and succumb to the indignity of fusion. For some reason, and no one knows why, the weight of two fused protons amounts to 99% of their combined weight. It's a law of nature and not a consequence of a law of nature that protons lose 1% of their mass when they fuse. Multiply that 1% by the speed of light squared, and it amounts to a staggering sum. The visible universe as we know it, along with all life on Earth, owe their existence to this slight but ongoing loss of mass in stellar interiors. E equals mc squared may be the most elegant equation in the history of science, yet its equal sign masks the enormity of the violence that converts mass into energy at the center of stars. That conversion creates the massless quanta we call photons. Let there be light, and there was light. Well, not exactly. The photons engendered by nuclear fusion have a long, errant way to go before they are released from the sun as visible light. The estimate among astrophysicists vary considerably, yet it takes anywhere from 170,000 years to millions of years for a photon to make its way from the sun's core to the photosphere of the solar surface. The odyssey could not be more arduous, for at every turn, the photon gets absorbed and re-radiated by the atoms it interacts with, and that's why astronomers refer to it as the photon's drunken walk through the body of the star. A poet might compare it to a gestation. I would compare it to a penance or mortification, since the photon encounters only obstruction in its outward drive, so much so that by the time it completes its journey, it emerges at the star's surface in a bruised and battered state, no longer a high-energy gamma ray, but as much weaker ultraviolet and infrared light. Let there be light, and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years later, there was light. Nothing could be more antithetical to the photon's drunken walk than its subsequent rectilinear dash through interstellar space at 300,000 kilometers per second. And it takes exactly 8 minutes and 20 seconds for a photon to reach planet Earth from the sun's photosphere. And if it should happen to find its way to your eyeball, then a new stage of its odyssey begins. It first passes through your cornea, then through your lens, and then onto the retina at the back of your eye. On this thin layer of tissue, with its light-sensitive nerve cells, the photon impinges on either a cone or a rod, which converts the packet of light into an electric impulse that is conveyed to your brain by the optic nerve. Once it reaches your brain, the photon's trek comes to an end. Its massless packet of energy now gets absorbed into your living matter. About 500 million photons enter the cornea of a human eye every second, either directly or by bouncing off objects and thereby rendering them visible. Half of those photons reach the retina and enter the brain as electrical impulses, bringing with them a flood of kinetic, visual images from the external world. What cuts sweetly through our marrow about the facts I have just laid out is that the inner coils of human vision connect with the inner core of our blazing sun, lending credence to the ancient Greek doctrine that like is only known by like. In other words, that the eye's internal fire interacts with the external fire of visible light, making sight, images, and ideas possible. Now, this is sketchy enough, but at this point we have gone as far as physics and physiology can take us by way of explanation when it comes to accounting for how light and all the objects we encounter day in and day out become visible to us. Here now is another closely related fact with two surfaces. The objective scientific description of how photons and visions work tell us next to nothing about how the visible world in fact appears to us. This blind spot in the scientific picture is truly mysterious, and since there is some intrigue here, I would like to invite the Nobel physicist Erwin Schrödinger to join us. I call on Schrödinger for two reasons. First, because he was especially mystified by this blind spot, and second, because these Clark lectures I'm delivering seem like an appropriate occasion to resurrect some largely forgotten reflections that Schrödinger first made public here at Trinity College. I'm referring to the Tarner lectures he delivered on the topic of mind and matter back in October 1956. And those lectures are remarkable from many points of view. Schrödinger had an uncommon capacity to be wonderstruck by the insights and paradoxes of science. In his Tarner lecture, he probed one paradox in particular, which he phrased as follows, quoting Schrödinger. All our knowledge about the world around us rests entirely on immediate sense perception. Yet in the picture or model we form of the outside world, guided by our scientific discoveries, all sensual qualities are absent. Schrödinger explains that if you ask a physicist what his idea of yellow light is, he will tell you that it is transversal electromagnetic waves of wavelength in the neighborhood of 590 millimicrons. Yet if you ask him where the sensation yellow fits in, the physicist will answer that it does not enter his picture at all. All he can tell us is these kinds of vibrations, when they hit the retina of a healthy eye, give the person whose eye it is the sensation of yellow. That was a quote from Schrödinger. Neither the physicist's description of light waves nor the physiologist's description of retinas, nerve fibers, brain processes, etc., can account for the sensation of color as color. In Schrödinger's words, we may be sure there is no nervous process whose objective description includes the characteristic yellow color or sweet taste, just as little as the objective description of an electromagnetic wave includes either of these characteristics. In his ensuing discussion of sound, Schrödinger arrives at the same conclusion, namely, I quote, that neither the physicist's description nor that of the physiologist contains any trait of the sensation of sound. Conclusion, I quote Schrödinger again, sensation simply is not contained in our scientific picture, but is only in the mind of the person whose ear and brain we are speaking. Whatever mind is, we will not find it in the body, according to Schrödinger. Quote him again, we have entirely taken to thinking of the mind and personality of a human being, or for that matter, also of an animal, as located in the interior of the body, usually an inch or two behind the midpoint of the eyes. So let's take a look behind those eyes, say of someone at a train station about to depart. What do we find? Quoting Schrödinger again, let him speak in his own words. Several effervescent bundles of pulsating currents, issuing from the brain and through long cellular protrusions, which are motor nerve fibers. These currents are conducted to certain muscles of the arm, which, as a consequence, tends a hesitating, trembling hand to bid you farewell for a long, heart-rending separation. At the same time, you may find that some other pulsating bundles produce a certain glandular secretion so as to veil the poor, sad eyes with a crepe of tears. But nowhere along this way, from the eye through the central organ to the arm muscles and the tear glands, nowhere, you may be sure, however far physiology advances, will you ever meet the personality, will you ever meet the dire pain, the bewildered worry within this soul. So it bears mention, if only in passing, that the human eye emits as well as receives. It emits tears whose water molecules contain no trace of the pain that brought them forth. Where does that pain reside? Who knows? Who is to say? In my previous lecture, I mentioned that our terrestrial atmosphere is like the vitreous substance of a planetary eye that looks out at the sun and the other stars. This orb weeps. We may not see the lacrimae rerum, yet when it's a poet like Virgil who does the looking, the sentient beings of the earth, in fact, are tears of a general suffering. It's the famous lacrimae rerum, the tears of things. When it's a visionary like St. Paul who looks, the tears extend from living things to all of creation. Romans 8:22, for we know that the whole of creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. That groan, heard by a different kind of ear, has gotten a lot louder of late. Now, at times, Schrödinger speaks of mind as the anything that perception can encompass. And this would extend mind to animals, plants, and all other embodied beings that inhabit the earth. At other times, he calls mind the subject of cognizance, suggesting a consciousness or even a human consciousness of sorts. Either way, the mind for Schrödinger is not a neurological entity because he could not accept the fact that the animal brain, arising as it did from a wholly contingent evolutionary development, is the sine qua non of mind. For him, the animal brain is a very special contraption, as he calls it, that facilitates the propagation and preservation of certain species. But before these species, and in particular Homo sapiens, came into being, was the universe a glorious spectacle without witness? Or in his words, should it all have been a performance to empty stalls? Nay, may we call a world that nobody contemplates even that a world? Schrödinger's answer is no. A slightly longish quote again. Most painful is the absolute silence of our scientific investigations toward our questions concerning the meaning and scope of the whole display. The more attentively we watch it, the more aimless and foolish it appears to be. The show that is going on obviously acquires a meaning only with regard to the mind that contemplates it. But what science tells us about this relationship is patently absurd, as if mind had only been produced by that very display that it is now watching and would pass away with it when the sun finally cools down and the earth has been turned into a desert of ice and snow. And you can all understand why I rely on the authority of Schrödinger for these sorts of claims, because if I was making them in my own voice, it would seem ridiculous. Who is Robert Harrison to tell us that science, has these kind of limitations? In any case, recoiling from that absurdity, Schrödinger takes a leap into a Buddhistic-flavored mysticism. Without any warrant that I can discern, he posits the existence of a great cosmic mind whose love affair with the universe has been going on since the beginning of time. He offers not an argument, but an analogy. Sometimes a painter will smuggle into his painting a discrete self-portrait, the way Michelangelo did in a corner of his fresco of the Last Judgment, or the way Homer did when he portrayed the blind bard singing of the Trojan War in the court of the Phaeacians. Schrödinger declares, "To me, this seems to be the best simile of the bewildering double role of mind. On the one hand, mind is the artist who has produced the whole. In the accomplished work, however, it is but an insignificant accessory that might be absent without detracting from the total effect." Precisely where a mystery opens up and something inscrutable stakes its claim, the scientist in Schrödinger shrinks away from the revelation and proposes instead an explanation. And that's one of the great thresholds between explanation and revelation. There's two different modes of seeing things. But he proposes a rather mystifying explanation. What science tells us about the relationship between mind and cosmos may be patently absurd, as he claims, yet, and this is me speaking now, there is a difference between an absurdity that is false and one that is unfathomable. It is indeed absurd that throughout its history, the universe was a performance to empty stalls, that the stars had not those for whom they shine, to recall Zarathustra. Even to this day, the cosmos remains mostly a spectacle without witness. That it makes a partial appearance on this wayward planet of ours and nowhere else, as far as we know, is absurd, but true. We live on this earth immersed in riddles. The scimitar's two surfaces edge into a mysterium that science cannot account for. The central perceptions on which its knowledge depends is perplexing enough. That the world comes to us textured in sounds, forms, colors, and other prodigious appearances is even more so. Whence the self-manifestation of the phenomena? Is life the condition of possibility for phenomena, or does apparency have a more arcane source? So most Darwinians see the exuberant form and coloring of this dove as an external envelope that contains and protects the bird's inner organic essence. They identify that inner essence with the intake of food and self-preservation. Richard Dawkins goes so far as to call living things mere machines for the invisible molecules that, inside of these machines, go about the business of self-replication. Quoting Dawkins, "These molecular replicators are in you and me. They created us, body and mind, and their preservation is the ultimate rationale for our existence. They have come a long way, those replicators. Now they go by the name of genes, and we are their survival machines." The great Richard Dawkins. Can't be wrong, can you, Noah? Dawkins speaks for a pervasive dogma in biology which holds that the forms and appearances of animals are functions of the life process, that the external shape of the animal serves to conserve the inside apparatus through movement and intake of food, avoidance of enemies, and finding sexual partners. The Swiss biologist Adolf Portmann begs to disagree. In his marvelous book, Animal Forms and Patterns, published in the 1940s, Portmann examines in exhaustive detail the appearances of many species of birds, mammals, and plants, and he finds that the functionalistic explanation, which reduces outer veneers to the twofold purposes of self-preservation and preservation of the species, simply crumbles before the visual evidence. Quoting him, "Prior to all functions for the purpose of the preservation of the individual and the species, we find the simple fact of appearing as self-display that makes those functions meaningful." The plumage of birds, for example, quoting him, Portmann, which at first we consider to be of value as a warm protective covering, is thus in addition so formed that its visible parts, and these only, build up a colored garment, the intrinsic worth of which lies solely in its visible appearance. Of a crow's feather, Portmann remarks, the tip is an iridescent bluish black, the lower part of silky down is light gray. It is as if a painter's brush had passed lightly over the ends of these insignificant-looking mouse-colored feathers so as to give them a beautiful sheen and outward show. The tip of each has its surface colored delicately. Portmann provides overwhelming evidence for what he identifies as the urge to self-display in living things. Of hummingbirds, he writes the following: "How great a difference there may be between the visible and invisible parts of a single feather can be seen in hummingbirds' plumage of shimmering colors. Here, the iridescence is produced according to the same optical laws as operate in the case of soap bubbles. In the feather, too, it depends on phenomena of interference in the thin lamellae. The iridescent lamellae develop an outermost delicate, colorless, horny layer on the finest part of the feather, the barbules. A reflecting surface is produced by the broadening of the individual barbules and their arrangement in the same direction. The color range of the iridescence is determined by the degree of fineness of the outermost membrane, so that one feather shows more of the red gold and another of the yellow-green or blue-violet parts of the spectrum. But all these special structures occur only on that part of the feather which is visible. There is no such iridescence on the parts which are covered up by the arrangements of the feathers." The mezzo del camino, we're halfway home. Portmann's investigations into animal forms and patterns led him to distinguish between what he called authentic and inauthentic appearances. That's to say, between the external veneers that are meant to appear and the internal apparatuses that don't naturally show themselves to the world, such as the roots of plants and the inner organs of animals. Authentic appearances are finely differentiated, individuated above all, and variegated. On the whole, they observe principles of symmetry, whereas the inner organs of animals are clustered together in what seems like a haphazard disposition, with none of the orderly patterns and subtle tapestries of the external surfaces. Here is a Thoreauvian fact with an edge to it. Whereas any of us can distinguish between one tiger from another in a zoo, trained biologists, when confronted with their inner organs, are often unable to tell the difference between a lion and a tiger, let alone the individuals of either species. Now, I'm greatly sympathetic to Portman's claims about the urge to self-display in nature, yet rather than squabble with biologists over whether living beings appear in order to survive or survive in order to appear, I would simply point out that the exuberance of appearance goes well beyond living matter. Hannah Arendt declares that what can see, hear, and touch wants to be seen, heard, and touched. That's fair enough. Yet a coastline, a mountain range, a crystal, a bending river, or the night sky in its stellar pullulations, none of these phenomena has apperception or proprioception, yet their apparent forms and surfaces are as finely textured as the skin, hide, sparks, and feathers of living things. What is it that calls forth such displays, even where nothing bears witness to them? To what must we ascribe the self-disclosing imperative of our planet, if I may call it that? So my answer to that question is the Phainosphere. I derive that term from the Greek phainestai, to appear or shine. It eludes definition, to be sure, yet the Phainosphere could be thought of as the irradiating thaumaturgical medium that transmutes matter into phenomenon, thereby rendering it visible, audible, perceptible, and in the broadest sense, accessible. It does not exist independently of the biosphere, yet the Phainosphere has no cells, no organs, no metabolism. As the invisible membrane of the visible world, it separates, yet also interrelates, what Schrödinger calls matter and mind, what Thoreau calls the two surfaces of facts, and what Portman calls authentic and inauthentic appearances. That matter comes into view, that it manifests and displays itself here on earth, that is the mysterium. And by mysterium, what I mean is the Phainosphere's abyssal depths, those depths that continue to engulf the phenomenon even as it emerges into the light of appearance. No matter how boldly it may come forth into view, there is always something in the phenomenon that withdraws, withholds, or rebuffs. It appears only partially and often incomprehensibly, like the fragment of a pattern that itself does not appear. This reserve in the givenness of things haunts and even taunts us. And with these words, I am conjuring up another ghost whose presence I feel very intensely here at Cambridge. I mean the ghost of Virginia Woolf, whose father, I believe, was the first person ever to deliver a Clark lecture. No one, with the possible exception of Joseph Conrad, in my view, sensed more profoundly than Virginia Woolf the abyssal character of appearances. What I would not give for all of us to be able to get up now and walk over to the Arts Society at Newnham College to hear Woolf deliver her paper, Women and Fiction, on which her book, A Room of One's Own, is based. This facsimile of the letter that Leonard Woolf wrote, donating the original manuscript of the paper to some institution here at Cambridge. I'm not sure which one. But of course, we are 95 years too late to go to Newnham College and hear her actually deliver those lectures in person. However, in A Room of One's Own, what I am calling the mysterium, Virginia Woolf calls reality. I quote, "What is meant by reality? It would seem to be something very erratic, very undependable, now to be found in a dusty road, now in a scrap of newspaper in the street, now in a daffodil in the sun. It lights up a group in a room and stamps some casual saying. It overwhelms one walking home beneath the stars and makes the silent world more real than the world of speech. And then there it is again in an omnibus in the uproar of Piccadilly. Reality, especially modern reality, comes at us fast and furious in disconnected apparitions. In her memoir, A Sketch of the Past, which she began writing in 1939, Woolf calls the intensification of our perception of reality moments of being. I quote her at length here. Often when writing my novels, I have been baffled by how to describe what I call in my private shorthand non-being. Every day includes much more non-being than being. I have already forgotten what Leonard and I talked about at lunch yesterday and at tea. Although it was a good day, the goodness was embedded in a kind of nondescript cotton wool. This is always so. A great part of every day is not lived consciously. As a child, my days, just as they do now, contained a large proportion of this cotton wool, this non-being. Then, for no reason that I know about, there was a sudden violent shock. Something happened so violently that I have remembered it all my life. Woolf goes on to recount 3 such instances that took place during her family's long summer vacations at St. Ives on the Cornwall coast. One had to do with fighting with her brother, Thoby, on the lawn. Just as she raised her fist to hit him, she felt, why hurt another person? She dropped her hand and let her brother pummel her. I remember a feeling of hopeless sadness. It was as if I became aware of something terrible, and of my own powerlessness, I slunk off alone, feeling horribly depressed. Another instance involved overhearing her parents mention the suicide of one of their acquaintances. Walking by an apple tree in the garden that night, the young Virginia felt that the apple tree was somehow connected with Mr. Valpy's suicide. I could not pass it. I stood there in the moonlight looking at the gray-green creases of the bark in a trance of horror. I seemed to be dragged down hopelessly into some pit of absolute despair from which I could not escape. My body seemed paralyzed. The third instance was less traumatic, but no less decisive. I was in the garden at St. Ives. I was looking at the flower bed by the front door. That is the hole, I said. I was looking at a plant with a spread of leaves, and it seemed suddenly plain that the flower itself was a part of the earth, that a ring enclosed what was the flower, and that was the real flower, part earth, part flower. It was a thought I put away as being likely to be very useful to me later. So the revelation that the real flower included more than the apparent plant, that it included the earth as well as the horizon ring, was, by her own admission, generative of Woolf's future career as a writer. It requires a shock to the nervous system to see beyond the cotton wool. I quote, "This shock-receiving capacity is what makes me a writer. Ever since I saw the flower in the bed by the front door at St. Ives, I realized that behind the cotton wool of daily life is hid a pattern, and that we, I mean all human beings, are connected with this, and that the whole world is a work of art, and that we are parts of the work of art." Woolf sounds like a Kantian of sorts here, especially when she goes on to say, there is some real thing behind appearances, and I make it real by putting it into words. It is only by putting it into words that I make it whole. This wholeness means that it has lost its power to hurt me. It gives me, perhaps because by doing so I take away the pain, a great delight to put the severed parts together. So we're reminded here of Schrodinger's cosmic artist, who in producing the Great Display rescues it from absurdity. In Woolf's case, the artist rescues everyday experience from its fragmentations by making it whole in words. Of course, it is one thing to author a book, quite another to author a cosmos. None of us is the artist of primary reality. The cotton wool of daily life may obscure it, and the artist's vision may reorganize it, yet in the end, all of us live in an incongruous reality of severed parts, fractured perceptions, and the drawing back of things into the impenetrable depths of their epiphanies. Virginia Woolf's sensitivity to the drift of appearances into enigma created a new style of writing, which she called her method. I will not go into the style here, but I will quote instead some sentences from her diary, recorded on September 30th, 1926, while she was finishing her novel To the Lighthouse. It is not oneself, but something in the universe that one's left with. It is this that is frightening and exciting in the midst of my profound gloom, depression, boredom, whatever it is. One sees a fin passing far out. What image can I reach to convey what I mean? Really, there is none, I think. Life is, soberly and accurately, the oddest affair, has in it the essence of reality. I used to feel this as a child. The utter weirdness of the real impinges on the psyche from outside. It is not oneself, but something in the universe that makes moments of being indecipherable. One sees a fin passing far out. A fin breaks a surface, it moves, the movement beckons. To where? To the sea itself. But what does the fin's revelation conceal? That's the question. I mean, it's at one and the same time a revelation and a concealment. The fin is not a synecdoche of the body it belongs to. It is the epiphany of a symbol. A symbol of what? Of the body of water the fin swims in, or to put it more recklessly, it is a symbol of the Phainosphere itself, where things appear as stray parts of some abyssal whole. Beneath the surface of that ocean of being, which is in us as much as outside of us, spreads the dark. Into the Lighthouse, Woolf writes that Mrs. Ramsay had within herself, I quote, a wedge-shaped core of darkness, something invisible to others. The things you know us by are simply childish. Beneath it is all dark, it is all spreading, it is unfathomably deep, but now and again we rise to the surface, and that is what you see us by. Let this serve as a gloss on the fin in Woolf's diary. The fin is what you see us by. With these remarks, I'm entering into obscure waters that perhaps only poetry can navigate properly. So to bring this lecture to an end, I will turn to a poem that places us in the thick of the Phainosphere's chiaroscuro. And turn is the right word in this case because the poem is full of turnings. Its twilight scene shows us, rather than tells us, how, quote, life is soberly and accurately the oddest affair that has in it the essence of reality. Reciting Virginia. The poem, Domination of Black, is by the American poet Wallace Stevens. I'll read it aloud. Like many Stevens poems, it's a little bit abstract and conceptual, but also beautiful. At night, by the fire, the colors of the bushes and of the fallen leaves, repeating themselves, turned in the room, like the leaves themselves turning in the wind. Yes, but the color of the heavy hemlocks came striding, and I remembered the cry of the peacocks. The colors of their tails were like the leaves themselves turning in the wind. In the twilight wind, they swept over the room, just as they flew from the boughs of the hemlocks down to the ground. I heard them cry, the peacocks. Was it a cry against the twilight or against the leaves themselves, turning in the wind, turning as the flames turned in the fire, turning as the tails of the peacocks turned in the loud fire, loud as the hemlocks, full of the cry of the peacocks? Or was it a cry against the hemlocks? Out of the window, I saw how planets gathered like the leaves themselves turning in the wind. I saw how the night came striding like the color of the heavy hemlocks. I felt afraid, and I remembered the cry of the peacocks. So this phrase, the leaves themselves, occurs in each of the poem's 3 stanzas. The leaves turn in 3 senses, at least, I think. They twist on their stems, ready to detach. They twirl on the ground, and they turn color in the fall. The colored tails of the peacocks intermingle with the colors of the leaves, bushes, and hemlock trees, all of which congregate and interfuse in the firelight of the room. This fire draws its energy from the black shadows that surround its pyrodelic recirculation of colors and images. The fear mentioned at the end of the poem relates to the night that comes striding over the world, threatening to swallow up the Phainosphere as a whole. The wind is that night's invisible ambassador. What turns in the wind outdoors returns in the fire scene indoors, including the peacocks and their tails. Now, the peacock is a pretty surreal choice of bird to place among the suburban hemlock trees outside the poet's window. It is said to have a plaintive cry, which would make it an appropriate voice to raise against the night. Was it a cry against the twilight? Was it a cry against the hemlocks? Yet the emphasis placed on the bird's tail feather recalls the Phainosphere's surplus of aesthetic display. The vainest of birds, the peacock has a great deal to lose in the striding darkness. The sudden shift of perspective in the poem's last stanza, from the pyrodelics taking place indoors to a vision of planets in the heavens, comes as a jolt. It's as if the wind blowing through the hemlock trees outside reaches up into the heavens to turn the planets in their orbits like leaves in the wind. In 2 short verses, the poem brings the planets close and sends the hemlock leaves out into space. This compression and twisting of distance occasion a recall of the peacock's cry. In this compression, the poem reveals the cosmic original of the peacock's tail feather, namely the night sky alight with stars and planets. In full display, the peacock's tail feather resembles nothing if not the firmament ablaze with points of light. So I began my talk in the blazing furnace that produces the photons that bathe our world with visible light, only to descend into the darkness of a striding night that haunts with its shadows of death and extinction. We cannot have one without the other. The cosmos comes into view thanks to the bottomless depths of darkness, without which planets would not turn in the sky like leaves, nor would the cosmos offer us any spectacle whatsoever, either in the heavens or on the peacock's tail. We know that the visible world will one day disappear, maybe sooner rather than later, while the domination of a black without color will remain. We also know that whatever the underlying and overhanging darkness may forebode, we find it on either side of the mind-matter divide. Insofar as we sense its presence, and insofar as the stars shine only in and through its calignosity, the wedge-shaped core of darkness that belongs to the Phainosphere as a whole, as it does to Mrs. Ramsey and the rest of us, who are as leaves in the wind. In my next lecture, I will seek out some of the unseen presences that haunt it. Thank you.